Hi everybody, it's sleepy story time. Let's see. Hey, that looks better. Let's see if I can find our video. One friend is watching. Perfect. Two, yay! Make sure you write hi in the comments because sometimes I can't see who's here until you write your name in the comments. I think it has to do with our parents' privacy settings on their Facebook. So if you write hi on Facebook, then I will be able to see who's here watching. Just going to get our Instagram started. Hi everybody on Instagram. Did everybody have lunch and go outside for a little bit? Oh, is Hannah here? Hi, Mariah. Mariah, this is the first time I've seen you at the beginning. Oh. Our Instagram's just having one little problem. Hold on. Let's fix up our Instagram. Hi, Instagram friends! Sorry, I went live in the wrong place for a second, but I'm back now. Hi, Gabe. Hi, Henry. All right, I think we have a lot of people here ready to listen. Okay, we're back with holes. Now, before we start, by the time I'm done reading, hi Hannah, by the time I'm done reading, I'm going to need you to have like a scrap piece of paper and a pen or pencil or crayon just to write a couple of things down. But you don't need that until I'm totally done. It's going to have to do with our activity that we're doing this week. So just think about that. Maybe if you see a pen or paper, or you can walk around with your iPad while I'm reading to go grab them. Hi, Zoe! I think this is the first time I've seen you during a live. Hey, bud! That's great! That means we have 3 of our original Tween the Pages members here right now, right at the beginning. That's amazing. Oh, and Emily's here too! Yeah! All right, so the last time we were reading, some crazy stuff was happening. Emily, since you just joined, let me tell you what I told our other friends. By the time we're done reading, you're going to need a piece of paper, like just a scrap paper, and a pen or a pencil so you can write a couple of things down. It's going to be our activity for this week. If this is just in case you didn't print out the printable, because you don't always have to print out the printables, they're just for fun. But by the time we're done reading, you'll need a piece of paper and something to write with. All right. Mariah is so excited. So we left off at a pretty exciting and crazy part. Zero stood up for himself against the mean counselors that were not being very nice. They were being pretty rude. And he actually hit Mr. Sir with a shovel, which was kind of scary. That's not really the best way to deal with hard situations. But he hit Mr. Sir with a shovel, and then he ran off into the desert with nothing. He just ran out there to escape from Camp Green Lake. And now Stanley is alone at Camp Green Lake, and the other kids are not really very happy with him because Zero's been digging his holes for him, and yeah, they're just not really being very friendly to Stanley. So where we're starting is Zero has just run away, and all of the kids are still in the lake digging their holes. Chapter 31. Stanley angrily dug his shovel into the dirt. He was angry at everyone. Mr. Pendanski, the warden, Zigzag X-Ray, and his no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. But mostly, he was angry at himself. He knew he should have never let Zero dig part of his hole for him. He still could have taught him to read, even if he wasn't digging his hole. If Zero could dig all day and still have the strength to learn, then Stanley should have been able to dig all day and still have the strength to teach him. What he should do, he thought, was go after Zero. But he didn't. None of the others helped him dig Zero's hole, and he didn't expect them to. Zero had been helping him dig his own holes, and now he had to dig Zero's. He remained out on the lake, digging during the hottest part of the day, long after everyone else had gone in. He kept an eye out for Zero, but Zero didn't come back. It would have been easy to go out after Zero. There was nobody there to stop him. He kept thinking about how that's what he should do. Maybe they could climb to the top of the Big Thumb. If it wasn't too far away, and if it really was the same place where his great-grandfather found refuge, then... And if, after 100 years or so, maybe water was still there. It didn't seem likely, not when an entire lake had gone dry. And even if they did find refuge on Big Thumb, he thought they'd still have to come back here eventually, and then they'd both have to face the warden and her rattlesnake fingers. Instead, he came up with a better idea. Although he didn't have it quite figured out yet, he thought that maybe he could make a deal with the warden. He'd tell her where he really found the gold tube, if she wouldn't scratch Zero with her rattlesnake fingernails. He wasn't sure how he'd make this deal without getting himself in deeper trouble. She might just say, "Tell me where you found it," or "I'll scratch you too." Plus, it would mean that X-Ray would get in trouble too. She'd probably scratch him up as well. X-Ray would be out to get him for the next 16 months. He dug his shovel into the dirt. By the next morning, Zero still hadn't returned. Stanley saw one of the counselors sitting guard by the water spigot outside the shower wall. Mr. Pendanski had 2 black eyes and a bandage over his nose. Stanley was required to dig only 1 hole the next day, but as he dug, he kept a constant watch for Zero. He never saw him. Once again, he considered going out onto the lake to look for him, but then he began to realize that it was already too late. His only hope was that Zero had found God's thumb on his own. It wasn't impossible. His great-great-grandfather had found it, and for some reason, his great-grandfather had felt the urge to climb to the top of that mountain. Maybe Zero would feel the same urge. If it was the same mountain, if there was water still there. He tried to convince himself it wasn't impossible. There'd been a storm a few days ago. Maybe Big Thumb was actually some kind of natural water tower that caught and stored the rain. It was possible. He returned to his tent to find the warden, Mr. Sir, and Mr. Pendanski. They were all waiting for him. "Have you seen Zero?" the warden asked him. "No." "No sign of him at all?" "No." "Do you have any idea where he went?" "No." "You know, you're not doing him any favors if you're lying," said Mr. Sir. "He can't survive out there for more than a day or 2. "I don't know where he is," said Stanley. All 3 stared at Stanley as if they were trying to figure out if he was telling the truth. Mr. Pendanski's face was so swollen he could barely open his eyes. They were just slits. "Are you sure he has no family?" the warden asked Mr. Pendanski. "He's a ward of the state," Mr. Pendanski told her. "He was living on the streets when he was arrested." "Is there anyone who might ask questions? Social workers? Anybody who might take an interest in him?" "He had nobody," said Mr. Pendanski. "He was nobody." The warden thought a moment. "Okay, I want you to destroy all of his records." Mr. Pendanski nodded. He was never here, said the warden. Mr. Sir nodded. I don't think I can erase them completely from the state files, said Mr. Pendinsky. There's too many cross-references, but I can make it so it would be very difficult for anyone to ever find a record of him again. Like I said, no one will ever look. No one cares about Hector Zeroni. Good, said the warden. How sad is that? So all that stuff at the end means that Zero didn't really have a family. He was just an orphan. He was probably living in a group home or something like that, so he doesn't have any family that is looking for him right now or knows where he is. So they're going to destroy all the records and just pretend he was never at Camp Green Lake, which is super sad. Okay, chapter 32. 2 days later, a new kid was assigned to Group D. His name was Brian, but X-Ray called him Twitch because he was always fidgeting. Twitch was assigned to Zero's bed and Zero's crate. Vacancies don't last long at Camp Green Lake. Twitch had been arrested for stealing a car. He claimed he could break into a car, disconnect the alarm, and hotwire the engine all in less than 1 minute. I never planned to, steal one, he told them. But sometimes, I'll be walking past a real nice car parked in a deserted area and, I'll just start twitching. If you think I twitch now, you should see me when I'm around a car. The next thing I know, I'm behind the wheel. Thanks, Robert. Stanley lay on his scratchy sheets. It occurred to him that his cot no longer smelled bad. He wondered if the smell had gone away or if he'd just gotten used to it. Hey, caveman, said Twitch. Do we really have to get up at 4:30? You get used to it, Stanley told him. It's the coolest part of the day. He tried not to think about Zero, but it was too late. Either he made it to the Big Thumb or... What worried him the most, however, wasn't that it was too late. What worried him the most, what really ate at his insides, was the fear that it wasn't too late. What if Zero was still alive, desperately crawling around in the dirt, searching for water? He tried to force the image out of his mind. The next morning, out on the lake, Stanley listened as Mr. Sir told Twitch about the requirements for his hole. It needs to be as wide and as deep as your shovel. Twitch fidgeted. His fingers drummed against the wooden shaft of his shovel. His neck moved from side to side. You won't be twitching so much after digging all day, Mr. Sir told him. You won't have the strength to wiggle your pinky. He popped some sunflower seeds in his mouth, deftly chewed them up, and spat out the shells. This isn't a Girl Scout camp. The water truck came shortly after sunrise. Stanley got in line behind Magnet and ahead of Twitch. What if it isn't too late, he thought. He watched Mr. Sir fill X-Ray's canteen. The image of Zero crawling across the hot dirt remained in his head. But what could he do about it? Even if Zero was somehow alive for more than 4 days, how would Stanley ever find him? It would take days. He'd need a car. Or a pickup truck. A pickup truck with a tank of water in the back. Stanley wondered if Mr. Sir had left the keys in the ignition. He slowly backed away from the line, then circled over to the side of the truck. He looked through the window. The keys were there, dangling in the ignition. Stanley felt his fingers start to twitch. He took a deep breath to steady himself and tried to think clearly. He'd never driven before. But how hard could it be? This is really crazy, he told himself. Whatever he did, he knew he'd have to do it quickly before Mr. Sir noticed. It's too late, he told himself. Zero couldn't have survived. But what if it isn't too late? He took another deep breath. Think about this, he told himself. But there wasn't time to think. He flung open the door to the truck and climbed quickly inside. Hey! Shouted Mr. Sir. He turned the key and stepped on the gas pedal, and the engine revved. The truck didn't move. He pressed the pedal all the way to the floor, and the engine roared. But the truck was motionless. Mr. Sir came running around the side of the truck. The door was still open. "Put it in gear!" shouted Twitch from the back of the line. The gear shift was on the floor next to the seat. Stanley pulled the lever back until the arrow pointed to the letter D for drive. The truck lurched forward. Stanley jerked back against the seat and tightly gripped the wheel as the truck accelerated. His foot was pressed all the way to the floor. The truck went faster and faster across the dry lake bed. It bounced over a pile of dirt, and suddenly Stanley was slammed forward and then instantly slammed backward as an airbag exploded in his face. He fell out of the open door and onto the ground. He had driven straight into a hole. He lay on the dirt staring at the truck, which stuck lopsided into the ground, and he sighed. He couldn't blame his no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather this time. This time, it was his own fault. 100%. He had probably just done the stupidest thing he'd ever done in his short and miserable life. He managed to get to his feet. He was sore, but he didn't think he'd broken any bones. He glanced back at Mr. Sir, who remained where he was, staring at Stanley. Stanley ran. His canteen was strapped around his neck. It banged against his chest as he ran, and every time it hit against him, it reminded him that it was empty, empty, empty. Oh, isn't that chapter crazy? So Stanley stole the truck, crashed the truck, and now Stanley's running off into the desert with an empty canteen. Oh man, what do you guys think about that? Whew. We're on chapter 33 now. Stanley slowed to a walk. As far as he could tell, nobody was chasing him. He could hear voices from back by the truck, but he couldn't make out the words they were saying. Occasionally, he heard the revving of the engine, but the truck wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. He headed in what he thought was the direction of Big Thumb. He couldn't see it through the haze. Walking helped calm him down and allowed him to think clearly. He doubted he could make it to Big Thumb, and with no water in his canteen, he didn't want to risk his life on the hope that he'd find refuge there. He'd have to return to camp. He knew that, but he was in no hurry. It'd be better to return later, after everyone had a chance to calm down. And as long as he'd come this far, he might as well look for Zero. He decided he'd walk as long as he could until he was too weak to go any farther, and then he'd turn around and he'd go back. He smiled as he realized that wouldn't quite work. He would only go halfway as far as he thought he could go, so that he'd still have the strength to return, and then he'd have to make a deal with the warden. Tell her where he found Kate Barlow's lipstick tube and beg for mercy. He was surprised by how far out the holes extended. He couldn't even see the camp compound anymore, but still he kept passing holes, and just when he thought he'd passed the last hole, he'd come across another cluster of them a little farther away. Back at the compound, they dug in a systematic order, row upon row, allowing space for the water truck. But out here there was no system. It was as if every once in a while, in a fit of frustration, the warden would just pick a spot at random and say, "Well, what the heck, dig here." It was like trying to guess the winning numbers in the lottery. Stanley found himself looking down into each hole he passed. He didn't admit to himself what he was looking for. After more than an hour had gone by, he thought he'd surely seen the last hole, but then, off to the left, he saw another cluster of them. He didn't actually see the holes. He saw the mounds of dirt that surrounded them. He stepped over the mounds and looked in the first hole. His heart stopped. Down at the bottom was a family of yellow spotted lizards. Their large red eyes looked up at him. He leapt back over the mound and ran. He didn't know if they were chasing him. He thought he might have seen one leap out of the hole. He ran until he couldn't run any farther and then collapsed. They hadn't come after him. He sat there a while and caught his breath, and as he got back to his feet, he thought he'd noticed something on the ground. Maybe 50 yards away? It didn't look like much, maybe just a big rock, but in a land of nothingness, any little thing seemed unusual. He walked slowly toward it. The encounter with the lizards had made him very cautious. It turned out to be an empty sack of sunflower seeds. He wondered if it was the same one Magnet had stolen from Mr. Sir, although that didn't seem likely. He turned it inside out and found one seed stuck to the burlap. Lunch. Imagine having one sunflower seed for lunch. Oh man. Chapter 34. The sun was almost directly overhead. He figured he could walk for no more than an hour, maybe 2, before he had to turn back. It seemed pointless. He could see that there was nothing ahead of him, nothing but emptiness. He was hot, tired, hungry, and most of all, thirsty. But maybe he should just turn around now. Maybe he'd already gone halfway and he didn't know it. Then, looking around, he saw a pool of water less than 100 yards away from where he was standing. He closed his eyes and opened them to make sure he wasn't imagining it. The pool was still there. The red eyes are so creepy. Yes, they're very creepy. Especially because they can jump really high. Ooh. He hurried toward the pool of water, and the pool of water hurried away from him, moving as he moved, stopping when he stopped. There wasn't any water. It was a mirage caused by the shimmering waves of heat rising off the dry ground. He kept walking. He still carried the empty sack of sunflower seeds. He didn't know if he might find something to put in it. After a while, he thought he could make out the shape of the mountains through the haze. At first, he wasn't sure if this was another kind of mirage, but the farther he walked, the clearer they came into view. Almost straight ahead of him, he could see what looked like a fist with a thumb sticking up. He didn't know how far away it was. 5 miles? 50 miles? One thing was certain, it was more than halfway. He kept walking toward it, although he didn't know why. He knew he'd have to turn around before he got there, but every time he looked at it, it seemed to encourage him, giving him the thumbs up sign. He continued walking. He became aware of a large object on the lake. He couldn't tell what it was, or even if it was natural or man-made. It looked like a fallen tree, although it didn't seem likely that a tree would grow here. More likely it was a ridge of dirt, or maybe rocks. The object, whatever it was not on the way to Big Thumb, but off to the right. He tried to decide whether to go to it or to continue toward Big Thumb, or maybe to just turn around. There was no point in heading toward Big Thumb, he decided. He would never make it. For all he knew, it was like chasing the moon. But he could make it to the mysterious object, so he changed directions. He doubted it was anything, but the fact that there was something in the middle of all this nothing made it hard for him to pass up. He decided to make the object his halfway point, and he hoped he hadn't already gone too far, that he wouldn't make it back. He laughed to himself when he saw what it was. It was a boat, or part of a boat anyway. It struck him as funny to see a boat in the middle of this dry and barren wasteland. But, after all, he realized, this was once a lake. The boat lay upside down, half buried in the dirt. Maybe somebody drowned here, he thought grimly, at the same spot where he could die of thirst. The name on the boat had been painted on the back. The upside-down red letters were peeled and faded, but Stanley could still read the name. Mary Lou. On one side of the boat, there was a pile of dirt, and then a tunnel leading below the boat. The tunnel looked big enough for a good-sized animal to crawl through. He heard a noise. Something stirred under the boat. It was coming out. "Hey!" Stanley shouted, hoping to scare it back inside. His mouth was very dry, so it was hardly a shout. It wasn't really loud. "Hey! Hey!" the thing answered weakly, and then a dark hand and an orange sleeve reached up out of the tunnel. No way! Chapter 35! Zero's face looked like a jack-o'-lantern that had been left out too many days past Halloween. His eyes were sunken, and he had a drooping smile. "Do you have water?" he asked. His voice was weak and raspy. His lips were so pale they were almost white, and his tongue seemed to flop around uselessly in his mouth as he spoke, as if it kept getting in the way. "It's empty," said Stanley. He stared at Zero, not quite believing that he was real. "I tried to bring you the whole water truck, but..." He smiled shyly. "I drove it into a hole. I can't believe you're..." "Me neither," said Zero. "Come on, we've got to go back to camp." Zero shook his head. "I'm not going back." "You have to. We both have to." "Do you want some sploosh?" Zero asked. "What?" Zero shaded his eyes with his forearm. "It's cooler under the boat," he said. Stanley watched Zero crawl back through his hole. It was a miracle that he was still alive, but Stanley knew he would have to get him back to camp soon, even if he had to carry him all the way. He crawled after him and was just able to squeeze his body through the hole. He never would have fit when he first came to Camp Green Lake. He'd lost a lot of weight. As he pulled himself through, his leg struck something sharp and hard. It was a shovel. For a second, Stanley wondered how it got there, but then he remembered that Zero had taken it with him after striking Mr. Pendanski. It was cooler under the boat, which was half buried in the dirt. There were cracks and holes in the bottom of the boat, which was now the roof, to provide light and air. He could see empty jars scattered about. Zero held a jar in his hand and grunted as he tried to unscrew the lid. "What is it?" "It's sploosh!" His voice was strained as he worked hard on the jar. "That's what I call it. They were buried under the boat." He still couldn't get the lid off. "I found 16 jars. Here, hand me the shovel." Stanley didn't have a lot of room to move. He reached behind him and grabbed the wooden end of the shovel and held it out to Zero, blade first. "Sometimes you just have to," Zero said, and then he hit the jar against the blade of the shovel, breaking the top of the jar clean off. He quickly brought the jar to his mouth and licked the sploosh off the jagged edges before it spilled. "Be careful," Stanley warned. Zero picked up the cracked lid and licked the sploosh off of there as well. Then he handed Stanley the broken jar and said, "Drink some." Stanley held it in his hands and stared at it a moment. He was afraid of the broken glass. He was also afraid of the sploosh. It looked like mud. Whatever it was, he realized, it must have been in the boat when the boat sank, and that meant it was probably over 100 years old. Who knew what kind of bacteria might be living in it? "It's good," said Zero, encouraging him. He wondered if Zero had heard of bacteria. He raised the jar to his mouth and carefully took a sip. It was warm, bubbly, mushy nectar, sweet and tangy. It felt like heaven as it flowed over his dry mouth and down his parched throat. He thought it might have been some kind of fruit at some time. Perhaps peaches. Zero smiled at him. "I told you it was good." Stanley didn't want to drink too much, but it was too good to resist. They passed the jar back and forth until it was empty. "How many are left?" he asked. "None," said Zero. Stanley's mouth dropped. "Now I have to take you back," he said. "I'm not digging any more holes," said Zero. "They won't make you dig," Stanley promised. "They'll probably send you to the hospital, like Barfbag." "Barfbag stepped on a rattlesnake," said Zero. Stanley remembered how he'd almost done the same. I guess he didn't hear the rattle. "He did it on purpose," said Zero. "You think?" He took his shoe and his sock off first. Stanley shivered as he tried to imagine it. "What's Mar-ya-la-oh-oo?" said Zero. "What?" Zero concentrated hard. Mar, ya, la, o, oo. I have no idea, said Stanley. I'll show you, said Zero. He crawled back out from under the boat. Stanley followed back outside, and he had to shield his eyes from the brightness. Zero walked around the back of the boat and pointed to the upside-down letters. R, ya, la, o, oo. Stanley smiled. Mary Lou! It's the name of the boat. Mary Lou, Zero repeated, studying the letters. I thought Y made the Y sound. It does, said Stanley, but not when it's at the end of a word. Sometimes Y is a vowel and sometimes it's a consonant. Zero suddenly groaned. He grabbed his stomach and he bent over. Zero, are you all right? Stanley asked. Zero dropped to the ground. He lay on his side with his knees pulled up to his chest. He continued to groan. Stanley watched helplessly. He wondered if it was the sploosh. He looked back towards Camp Green Lake. At least he thought it was the direction of Camp Green Lake, but he wasn't entirely sure. Zero stopped moaning, and his body slowly unbent. I'm taking you back, said Stanley. Zero managed to sit up. He took several deep breaths. Look, I got a plan so you won't get in trouble, Stanley assured him. Remember when I found the gold tube? Remember I gave it to X-Ray and the warden went crazy, making us dig where she thought X-Ray found it? I think if I tell the warden where I really found it, I think she'll let us off. I'm not going back, said Zero. You've got nowhere else to go, said Stanley. Zero said nothing. You'll die out here, said Stanley. Then I'll die out here. Stanley didn't know what to do. He'd come to rescue Zero and instead drank the last of his sploosh. He looked off into the distance. I want you to look at something. I just want you to look at the mountain up there. See the one that has something sticking out of the top of it? Yeah, I think. What does it look like to you? Does it look like anything? Zero said nothing. But as he studied the mountain, his right hand slowly formed a fist. He raised his thumb. His eyes went from the mountain to his hand and then back to the mountain. So Zero thinks it looks like a thumb too. Okay, what time is it? I think we can maybe read one more chapter and then we're going to have to stop for today. All right? This is chapter 36. Have you guys been liking the reading this week so far? These are some of the pretty exciting chapters. After all the chapters of digging holes. They put 4 of the unbroken empty jars in the burlap sack in case they might be able to use them. Mariah's not liking the chapters? Oh no. Maybe you can let me know why you're not liking them, Mariah. Stanley carried the sack and Zero held the shovel. I should warn you, Stanley said. I'm not exactly the luckiest guy in the world. Zero wasn't worried. Oh, Evelise says yes, she's liking them. Zero wasn't worried. When you spend your whole life living in a hole, he said, the only way you can go is up. They gave each other the thumbs up sign and then headed out. It was the hottest part of the day. Stanley's empty canteen was still strapped around his neck. He thought back to the water truck and wished he'd at least stopped and filled his canteen before driving off. They hadn't gone very far before Zero had another attack. He clutched his stomach and he let himself fall to the ground. Stanley could only wait for it to pass. The sploosh had saved Zero's life, but now it was destroying him from the inside. He wondered how long it would be before he too felt the effects. He looked at Big Thumb. It didn't seem any closer than when they first started out. Oh, Mariah didn't want to stop reading. She really liked what's going on. She wanted me to keep reading. Big Thumb didn't seem any closer than when they first started out. Zero took a deep breath and managed to sit up. "Can you walk?" Stanley asked him. "Just give me a second," Zero said. He took another breath and then, using the shovel, pulled himself back to his feet. He gave Stanley the thumbs up sign and they continued. Sometimes Stanley would try to go for a long while without looking at Big Thumb. He'd make a mental snapshot of how it looked and then wait maybe 10 minutes before looking at it again to see if it seemed closer. It never did. It was like chasing the moon. And if they ever reached it, he realized, then they would still have to climb it. "I wonder who she is," said Zero. "Who?" "Mary Lou," said Zero. Stanley smiled. "I guess she was once a real nice person on a real lake. It's hard to imagine." "I bet she was pretty," said Zero. "Somebody must have left her a lot to name a boat after her." "Yeah," said Stanley. "I bet she looked great in a bathing suit sitting in that boat while her boyfriend rowed." Do you guys remember who Mary Lou was? If you can remember who Mary Lou actually was, write down in one of the comments, because we've met Mary Lou earlier in the story. So thinking of Mary Lou in a bathing suit is pretty funny. "Yeah," said Stanley. Oh, Zero used the shovel as a third leg. 2 legs weren't enough to keep him going. "I've got to stop and rest," he said after a while. "Hiya, Karen!" "Hannah, I'm glad you're loving them so far." Stanley looked at Big Thumb. It still didn't look any closer. He was afraid if Zero stopped, he might never get started again. "We're almost there," he said. He wondered which was closer now, Camp Green Lake or Big Thumb. Hannah says she remembers who it was. It was Sam, the onion picker's donkey, who pulled his cart. That's Mary Lou. That's why it would be funny to think of her in a bathing suit. The school teacher is Kate, Mariah, but Mary Lou is the donkey. Good remembering, Hannah. Oh, Emily remembered too. So funny. He wondered which was closer, Camp Green Lake or Big Thumb. "I really have to sit down," said Zero. "Just see if you can go a little." Zero collapsed. The shovel stayed up for a fraction of a second longer, perfectly balanced on the tip of the blade, and then it fell next to him. Zero knelt, bent over with his head on the ground. Stanley could hear a very low moaning sound coming from him. He looked at the shovel and couldn't help but think that he might need it to dig Zero's last hole. And who will dig one for me, he thought. But Zero didn't get up. But Zero did get up, once again flashing the thumbs up. "Give me some words," he said weakly. It took Stanley a few seconds to realize what he meant, and then he smiled and said, "R-U-N." Zero sounded it out to himself. Run, run, run. Good. F-U-N. Fun. The spelling seemed to help Zero. It gave him something to concentrate on beside his pain and weakness. It distracted Stanley as well, and the next time he looked up at Big Thumb, it really did seem closer. They quit spelling words when it hurt too much to talk. Stanley's throat was dry. He was weak and exhausted, yet as bad as he felt, he knew that Zero felt 10 times worse. As long as Zero could keep going, he could keep going too. It was possible, he thought. He hoped that he didn't get any of the bad bacteria that Zero had. Zero hadn't been able to unscrew the lid of the jar they ate. Maybe the bad germs couldn't get in either. Maybe the bacteria were only in the jars which opened easily, and the ones he was now carrying in the sack. That scared Stanley the most. What? Maybe the bacteria was only in the jars that he was now carrying in his sack. What scared Stanley the most about dying in the desert wasn't his actual death. He figured he could handle the pain, It wouldn't be much worse than what he felt now. In fact, maybe at the moment he would be too weak to even feel pain. Maybe it would be a relief. What worried him the most was the thought of his parents not knowing what happened to him, not knowing whether or not he was dead or alive. He hated to imagine what it would be like for his mother and father, day after day, month after month, not knowing, living on false hope. For him, at least, it would be over. For his parents, the pain would never end. He wondered if the warden would send out a search party to look for him. It didn't seem likely. She didn't send anyone to look for Zero, but Zero didn't have a family. They just destroyed his files. But Stanley had a family. She couldn't pretend that he was never at Camp Green Lake. He wondered what she would tell his mom and dad, and when. "What do you think's up there?" Zero asked. Stanley looked to the top of Big Thumb. "Oh, probably an Italian restaurant," he said. Zero managed to laugh. "I think I'll get a pepperoni pizza and a large root beer," said Stanley. "I want an ice cream sundae," said Zero, "with nuts and whipped cream and bananas and hot fudge." The sun was almost directly in front of them, and the thumb pointed up towards it. They came to the end of the lake. Huge white stone cliffs rose up before them. Unlike the eastern shore, where Camp Green Lake was situated, the western shore did not slope down gradually. It was as if they'd been walking across the flat bottom of a giant frying pan, and now they had to somehow climb up out of it. They could no longer see Big Thumb. The cliffs blocked their view. The cliffs also blocked out the sun. Zero groaned and clutched his stomach, but he remained standing. "I'm all right," he whispered. Stanley saw a rut about a foot wide and 6 inches deep running down a cliff. On either side of the rut were a series of ledges. "Let's try climbing there," he said. It looked to be about a 50-foot climb straight up. Stanley still managed to hold the sack of jars in his left hand as he slowly moved up from ledge to ledge, crisscrossing the rut. At times, he had to use the side of the rut for support in order to make it to the next ledge. Zero stayed with him somehow. His frail body trembled terribly as he climbed the stone wall. Some of the ledges were wide enough to sit on, and others stuck out no more than a few inches, just enough for a quick step. Stanley stopped about 2/3 of the way up on a fairly wide ledge, and Zero came up alongside him. "You okay?" Stanley asked. Zero gave the thumbs up sign, and Stanley did the same. He looked above him. He wasn't sure how he'd get to the next ledge. It was 3 or 4 feet above his head, and he didn't see any footholds. He was afraid to look down. "Give me a boost," said Zero, "and then I'll pull you up with the shovel." "You won't be able to pull me up," said Stanley. "Yes, I will," said Zero. Stanley cupped his hands together, and Zero stepped into his interwoven fingers. He was able to lift Zero high enough for him to grab the protruding slab of rock. Stanley continued to help him from below as Zero pulled himself up onto the ledge. While Zero was getting himself situated up there, Stanley attached the sack to the shovel by poking a hole through the burlap, and then he held it up to Zero. Zero first grabbed hold of the sack and then the shovel, and he set the shovel so that half the blade was supported by the rock slab, and the wooden shaft hung down towards Stanley. "Okay," he said. Stanley doubted this would work. It was one thing for him to lift Zero, who was half his weight, but it was quite another for Zero to try and pull him up. Stanley grabbed hold of the shovel, and as he climbed up the rock wall, he used the sides of the rut to help support him. His hands moved one over the other up the shaft of the shovel. He felt Zero's hand clasp his wrist. He let go of the shaft with one hand and grabbed the top of the ledge. He gathered his strength and for a brief second seemed to defy gravity as he took a quick step up the wall and with Zero's help pulled himself the rest of the way over the ledge. He caught his breath. There was no way he could have done that a few months ago. He'd noticed a large spot of blood on his wrists, and it took him a moment to realize it was Zero's blood. Zero had deep gashes on both of his hands. He had held on to the metal blade of the shovel, keeping it in place as Stanley had climbed. Zero brought his hands to his mouth and sucked off the blood. One of the glass jars had broken in the sack, and they decided to save the pieces. They might need to make a knife or something. They rested briefly and then continued on up. It was a fairly easy climb the rest of the way, and when they reached flat ground, Stanley looked up to see the sun, a fiery ball bouncing on top of Big Thumb. God was twirling a basketball. Soon they were walking in the long, thin shadow of the thumb. And that's where we're going to stop right now for today. And next week we'll start on chapter 37. Look how far we are, guys. This is how much we have left. This little bit. And we've read this much. Oh, here we go, Facebook. Whoa. That's so much. All right. I know there's a little bit of lag from me talking to Facebook and maybe Instagram too. But I want you all to grab that piece of paper and pen or pencil that we talked about at the beginning before I started reading. I'll let you guys grab that for a second. Everybody ready? We are doing, for our activity this week, true or false questions. So, I'm going to read you the questions this week, and then if you hold on to your piece of paper, we'll talk about the right answers at the beginning of next week, okay? To see how many of these you actually know. So if you wanted to, you could print out the printable. It's 2 sheets. You could probably even print them smaller and get it to fit on 1 sheet if you had help with your printer at home. But it's 2 sheets full of questions, and you can circle true or false. Mariah doesn't want to stop reading. We're almost at the end, Mariah. We only have, I think, is it 13 more chapters left? Because we only have 50 chapters in this book. That's only like 2 more weeks of reading online. How crazy! And then we'll have to start another book. All right. Is everyone ready for true or false? Now, you could just write like number 1 and you could write true or just a T. And then when I go to the next question, you could write number 2 and write true or false on there. All right. So, at the top of this page, I put a quote from the book, and it says, "Isn't it more important for him to learn to read?" Stanley asked. "Doesn't that build more character than digging holes?" I don't know if you guys remember that part. So, question number 1. Stanley has bad luck because of his no good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing sister. True or false? Some of these might be easier than other ones. Some of them are going to be really tricky. All right. Question 2. Zero had water when he ran away from Camp Green Lake. True or false? And if you didn't have a piece of paper right now too, these worksheets are on Facebook, so you could even just look at the questions and write your answers on paper later while you're listening to us, and you can just think about your answers now. Question 3. Zero is related to Madame Zeroni. True or false? Question 4. The outlaw kissing Kate Barlow used to be a school teacher. True or false? All right. Number 5. Mary Lou was a horse. Question 6. Since Sam was killed, there's been no rain at Camp Green Lake. True or false? Question 7. The most dangerous animal at Camp Green Lake are the rattlesnakes. True or false? Did I say that was 7? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Number 8. Trout Walker has very smelly armpits. Question 9. The warden wears cowboy boots with turquoise gemstones. True or false? Question 10. Miss Catherine made delicious canned peaches. True or false? Question 11. Stanley's great-grandfather took refuge on a place called God's Thumb. True or false? And question 12. You are liking this book so far. True or false? The last one's the easiest question. But the other ones you guys might have to think about. Because some of those answers are from a few chapters ago. I kind of wanted to test and see how much you've been listening. And if you think maybe you missed a week, and maybe you didn't read about that or hear about that in the story, then just take a guess, because there's a 50% chance you'll be right, 50% chance you'll be wrong. And I'm going to tell you all the answers next week. It will be exciting to see if everybody got them all right or not. Okay, that's all I have for today. And I think next week is going to be another really exciting week in this book. Don't forget to tag Shelburne Library in any cool stuff you're doing about holes. It's really cool. Maybe you go outside and you dig a hole 6 feet wide and 60 feet deep in the backyard. I really want to see that if that happens. Don't do that. I think your parents will get mad. But maybe if you're out and you're digging your garden beds with your families, or you're starting to garden and something reminds you of holes, you could take a picture and tag us on Instagram or Facebook, and that would be pretty funny and cool. I hope you all are having a great week so far. Work hard on your schoolwork. It's probably nice how you only have to do a couple hours a day now instead of doing it all day. And I will see you next week again on Tuesday at 3:30. See you guys later.